Have you ever wondered why some people seem to stay in your mind long after they have left the room? You may meet hundreds of people during your lifetime, have thousands of conversations, and experience countless ordinary moments, yet certain people somehow become unforgettable. Sometimes it is not because they are the most attractive, the loudest, or even the most interesting person in the room. There is something much deeper happening inside the human brain. Your mind is constantly deciding what deserves attention and what can safely be forgotten. Every second, your senses receive an enormous amount of information. Faces, voices, sounds, emotions, movements, words, smells, and countless tiny details compete for a limited amount of mental attention. Most of this information disappears almost immediately, but certain experiences become stronger in memory because they create something psychologists call emotional or cognitive significance. This is why a simple conversation can sometimes stay with you for years, while an entire afternoon may disappear from your memory within days. The difference is not always the event itself. Often, it is how your brain interpreted that event. Today, we are going to explore 6 fascinating psychological principles that can make a person, an interaction, or an experience much more memorable. These principles are not magic tricks, and they should never be used to manipulate or control people. Instead, they help us understand how attention, memory, curiosity, and emotional association actually work. The first principle begins with something incredibly powerful: curiosity. When your brain encounters incomplete information, it naturally wants to complete the picture. Imagine someone begins telling you an interesting story and suddenly stops just before revealing what happened. Even if you are busy with something else, part of your attention may remain focused on that unfinished story. This happens because the human brain dislikes unresolved information. An unanswered question creates mental tension. Your mind wants closure, and that desire can keep the subject active in your thoughts. That is why mystery can sometimes be more memorable than certainty. Think about the last time someone told you, "I have something important to tell you, but I'll tell you later." Even before they explain anything, your brain may begin generating possibilities. What happened? What do they know? Why did they say that? Is it good news or bad news? The person has not actually given you much information, but they have created a question. And questions are powerful. The same principle appears in movies, books, advertisements, conversations, and even everyday relationships. When information is presented in a way that creates genuine curiosity, the brain becomes more motivated to keep paying attention. But there is an important distinction. Healthy curiosity comes from meaningful uncertainty, not from deliberately creating anxiety or confusion in. One of the strongest forces behind human attention is curiosity. When we know everything about something, our brain often has little reason to continue thinking about it. But when we know just enough to realize that something is missing, the situation changes. Imagine seeing a locked box on a table. If you already know exactly what is inside, you probably will not spend much time thinking about it. But if someone tells you that the box contains something important and refuses to explain what it is, your attention suddenly increases. You want to know. This simple experience demonstrates an important psychological idea. Incomplete information can create a strong desire for completion. Your brain begins treating the missing information almost like a small mental problem that needs to be solved. You may continue thinking about it while doing other activities. You might imagine different explanations. You may even replay the conversation in your head. This is one reason unanswered questions can be so powerful. But curiosity does not mean you should intentionally become mysterious or confusing. In fact, excessive mystery can have the opposite effect. If someone constantly hides information, refuses to communicate clearly, or deliberately keeps others uncertain, people may eventually become frustrated rather than interested. The strongest form of curiosity usually comes from meaningful information. For example, instead of saying, "I know something you don't know," imagine saying, "I discovered something fascinating about this subject, and there is one part of it that completely surprised me." The second approach gives the brain a reason to explore without creating unnecessary emotional pressure. Curiosity also explains why good storytelling works so well. A great storyteller does not immediately reveal every detail. Instead, information is released gradually. Each piece creates another question, and each question encourages the audience to continue. Think about a detective story. The audience does not know who committed the crime. Small clues appear throughout the story. One clue creates another question. Another clue changes the possible explanation. The audience keeps watching because the brain wants to resolve the mystery. You can see the same pattern in everyday conversations. A person who asks thoughtful questions can become memorable because they make other people think. Instead of constantly talking about themselves, they create opportunities for meaningful discussion. Ask someone about an experience that changed them. Ask what they learned from a difficult situation. Ask what they would do differently if they could repeat an important moment. These questions are more powerful than simple small talk because they activate reflection and personal memory. And when someone associates a conversation with deep thought or genuine emotional engagement, that conversation can become easier to remember. So the lesson is simple. The second major principle is emotional association. Think about some of your strongest memories. They may involve a celebration, an embarrassing moment, a frightening experience, an important achievement, a goodbye, or a conversation that completely changed the way you saw something. Notice what many of these memories have in common. Emotion. The human brain does not store every experience with equal importance. Emotion can act like a signal telling the brain, pay attention, this matters. That is why emotionally meaningful moments can remain vivid long after ordinary events have disappeared. If you meet someone during an emotionally significant moment, your brain may connect that person with the feelings you experienced at the time. Later, seeing that person's face, hearing their voice, or even encountering something associated with the moment can bring parts of the memory back. This is called emotional association. It is one reason music can instantly remind you of a specific period in your life. A particular smell can remind you of childhood. A location can bring back memories you had not consciously thought about for years. The object itself is not necessarily powerful. The association is. This principle also explains why people who make others feel genuinely understood can become memorable. When someone listens carefully, shows empathy, encourages you, or shares a meaningful experience, the interaction can become connected with a positive emotional state. But there is an important warning here. Creating strong emotions, intentionally just to make yourself unforgettable, can become manipulative. Fear, jealousy, guilt, and anxiety can also create powerful memories, but that does not make them healthy or desirable. The goal should never be to make someone emotionally dependent on you. Instead, the healthy approach is to create positive experiences naturally. Listen when someone speaks. Remember important details. Show appreciation. Share genuine humor. Be present during meaningful moments. Celebrate other people's successes. Offer support when appropriate. These behaviors can create positive emotional associations without manipulation. Consider a simple example. Imagine two people having a conversation. Person A is constantly checking their phone, interrupting and waiting for their turn to speak. Person B listens carefully, remembers what was said, and responds thoughtfully. Which person is more likely to leave a meaningful impression? Usually, it is the person who made the interaction feel important. That is because human beings often remember not only what happened, but also how they felt during the experience. And this gives us a powerful lesson about social interaction. You do not necessarily need to say something extraordinary to become memorable. Sometimes, making another person feel heard is enough. A sincere conversation can become a memory. A moment of kindness can become a memory. A genuine laugh can become a memory. Have you ever started watching a movie but had to stop before the ending? Or maybe you received a message that simply said, "We need to talk," and then the person disappeared for several hours. Suddenly, your mind becomes busy. You start imagining possibilities. What happened? What do they want to say? Is something wrong? Why haven't they explained? This happens because unfinished experiences can remain mentally active. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon through what is commonly known as the Zeigarnik effect. The basic idea is that incomplete tasks or unresolved situations can sometimes remain more accessible in our minds than completed ones. Think about your daily life. You may forget 10 things you finished yesterday, But remember the one task you started and never completed. Maybe you had an important email to send. Maybe you started repairing something and left it halfway. Maybe you had a conversation that ended without a clear conclusion. Your brain can continue returning to that unfinished situation because it has not received a satisfying sense of closure. This is closely connected to curiosity, but it is slightly different. Curiosity is about wanting information. The unfinished task effect is about wanting completion. And this distinction can explain why certain people or experiences remain in our thoughts. Imagine having a conversation with someone that ends naturally. You say goodbye, both people understand what happened, and the interaction feels complete. Compare that with a conversation where something important is left unsaid. Maybe you wanted to ask a question but never did. Maybe someone started explaining something and suddenly changed the subject. Maybe there was a misunderstanding that was never resolved. The second situation may occupy your thoughts much longer. This does not mean that every unfinished interaction will become unforgettable. Human memory is much more complicated than that. But unresolved experiences can receive additional mental attention, especially when they are personally important. There is also a positive way to use this understanding. If you are creating stories, videos, presentations, or educational content, you can organize information so that questions are introduced and then answered later. For example, instead of immediately revealing the most interesting discovery, you can first explain the problem, present the evidence, and allow the audience to wonder what the conclusion will be. This creates a natural reason to keep watching. But again, there is a difference between storytelling and manipulation. Using an unanswered question to make educational content more engaging is very different from intentionally creating emotional uncertainty in someone's personal life. In relationships, constantly disappearing, withholding information, or creating artificial uncertainty can damage trust. Healthy communication requires clarity. So the real lesson is not leave people confused so they think about you. Now let's look at another powerful reason why certain people and experiences stay in our minds: novelty. Your brain is constantly searching for patterns. When you see the same type of environment, the same routine, and the same behavior again and again, your brain becomes more efficient at processing it. This is useful because your mind does not have unlimited attention. If you walk through the same street every day, you probably do not consciously remember every building, every vehicle, every person, or every tree. Your brain gradually becomes familiar with the environment and stops giving every detail equal attention. But imagine that one morning, something completely unexpected happens. A building has a giant new sign. A musician is performing in the middle of the street. A person is wearing something completely unusual. Suddenly, your attention changes. Why? Because the brain notices differences. Novelty signals that something may deserve additional processing. This is one reason new experiences can feel more exciting than repetitive ones. The brain is encountering information that does not perfectly match its existing expectations. And when something violates your expectations in a meaningful way, it can become easier to remember. This does not mean you need to behave strangely to become memorable. In fact, trying too hard to appear unusual can have the opposite effect. The strongest form of novelty is often subtle. Imagine meeting someone who communicates in a slightly different way. Maybe they have an unusual perspective on a common topic. Maybe they tell stories in a creative way. Maybe they ask questions that you have never been asked before. That small difference can make the interaction stand out. This is especially important in today's world because people are exposed to enormous amounts of repeated information. Think about social media. Thousands of videos use similar sounds. Thousands of advertisements use similar phrases. Thousands of creators make similar thumbnails. Thousands of people repeat the same opinions. When everything starts looking and sounding the same, genuine originality becomes more noticeable. But originality does not mean being completely different from everyone else. It means adding something authentic that reflects your own perspective. For example, if everyone explains a topic with complicated terminology, someone who explains it through a simple story may stand out. If everyone is trying to speak as loudly as possible, someone who communicates calmly may become more noticeable. If everyone is trying to impress an audience, someone who asks a thoughtful question may create a stronger impression. Novelty works because it breaks a prediction. Your brain expects one thing, but receives another. That small prediction error can increase attention. And attention is closely connected to memory. If you are creating content, this principle can be extremely useful. There is another fascinating psychological principle that can explain why certain interactions remain in our minds: the peak end rule. The idea is surprisingly simple. When people remember an experience, they do not always remember every moment equally. Instead, their memory can be strongly influenced by the most emotionally significant moment and by how the experience ended. Think about a long day. Maybe you spent several hours doing ordinary things. Nothing particularly exciting happened. Then, near the end of the day, something wonderful happened. You met an old friend unexpectedly. You received great news. You watched an incredible sunset. When someone later asks you about the day, you may focus heavily on that memorable moment. Now imagine the opposite. Suppose the entire day was enjoyable, but the final few minutes involved an argument, disappointment, or stressful experience. That ending may influence how you remember the entire event. This does not mean the brain literally deletes every other part of the experience. Memory is much more complicated than that. But emotionally significant moments and endings can have a disproportionate influence on our overall evaluation of an experience. This principle has important applications in everyday life. Imagine meeting someone for the first time. You have a normal conversation. You discuss your work, hobbies, family, and everyday topics. Nothing extraordinary happens, but then, near the end, you have a genuinely interesting conversation about something meaningful. You laugh, you discover a surprising similarity, you exchange an inspiring idea. Then you say goodbye naturally. That final meaningful moment may become the part you remember most strongly. This is why endings matter. A good ending gives the brain a clear emotional conclusion. And this applies to more than relationships. It applies to presentations, stories, customer experiences, videos, conversations, and even ordinary days. Think about a movie. You might forget several scenes months later, but remember the final scene clearly if it was emotionally powerful. Think about a restaurant. You may not remember every detail of the meal, but you may remember the incredible dessert at the end or the friendly interaction before leaving. Think about a YouTube video. You may forget several facts from the middle, but if the creator ends with a powerful idea, you may remember that final message. That is why the ending of your content should not simply be an abrupt, "Thanks for watching." The ending should give the audience something worth carrying with them. It could be a question. It could be a surprising conclusion. It could be a practical lesson. It could be a powerful reminder. For example, after explaining how memory works, you could end by asking, what is one person or moment you still remember? And what emotion is connected to that memory? Now the audience is not simply finishing the video. They are thinking about their own life. And now we come to the final principle, and perhaps the most important one of all: personal meaning. You can create curiosity, you can create novelty, you can create emotional moments. You can tell a powerful story. But if an experience has no personal meaning for someone, it may still disappear from their memory. The human brain gives special importance to information that connects with the individual. Think about hearing your own name in a crowded room. You may be surrounded by dozens of conversations, but if someone suddenly says your name, your attention can immediately shift toward them. Why? Because the information is personally relevant. It concerns you. The same thing happens when someone talks about something you deeply care about. Imagine two people explaining the exact same subject. One person gives you a list of random facts. The other connects those facts to your goals, your experiences, your problems, or something you genuinely value. Which explanation are you more likely to remember? Usually the second one. Personal relevance gives information a stronger reason to matter. This is why people remember stories connected to their own lives. A sentence that seems ordinary to one person can be extremely meaningful to another. A song can be just a song to one listener, but for someone else, it can represent an entire chapter of their life. A photograph can look ordinary to a stranger, but to the person in the photograph, it may represent a moment they never want to forget. Meaning changes memory. This also explains why asking thoughtful questions can create stronger connections than simply trying to impress someone. When you show genuine interest in another person's experiences, you are entering their world. You might ask, What is something you have always wanted to accomplish? What experience changed the way you think? What is something you learned the hard way? What is one thing you are proud of? These questions can create deeper conversations because they connect directly to personal experiences and values. But there is an important rule. Do not pretend to care just because psychology says personal attention is powerful. People are often surprisingly good at detecting fake interest. If you are asking questions only to make someone remember you, the interaction may feel artificial. Instead, be genuinely curious. Listen to the answer. Remember what the person tells you. Respond naturally. That is where psychology becomes useful in a healthy way. The goal is not to control another person's thoughts. The goal is to understand how human attention and memory work so that you can communicate more effectively and build better relationships. So let's quickly bring everything together. First, curiosity can make the brain want to discover missing information. Second, emotional experiences can become stronger memories. Third, unfinished situations can remain mentally active because the brain wants closure.